Welcome to the Open Adoption Project. We're the Nelsons. I am Lynette.
And I'm Sean. In recognition of National Adoption Month, we have decided as a podcast family to create a little more content. Lynette and I and Alicia Gallagher, who is our Director of Communications, are doing some extra interviews and conversations with friends to help us in the adoption community learn more. So during the month of November, you can expect that we'll be in your newsfeed a little bit more. We hope that this is valuable to you and that it enriches your National Adoption Month.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Gallagher, Director of Communications at the Open Adoption Project. Today, we welcome Christelle Pellecuer to the podcast. Christelle joins us to share her experience as a transracial adoptee. She was adopted at the age of 10 from Madagascar to France, and for much of her young life lived in a white-dominant environment. Through her own work to reconnect with her racial and cultural identity, she is now an adoptee coach helping Black adoptees address the hardships they've experienced and begin to embrace their full identities. Christelle, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yes, I am too. Just to start things off, can you tell us about yourself? What is your story? There's so much already that just in the intro that we just want to dive into. So we'll just turn it over to you. You can tell us about yourself.
Okay, so wow, what just happened? Well, let's start from the beginning. I was born in Madagascar, which is a lot of people don't actually know where Madagascar is, but it's in one of the highlands of the coast of Africa. And I was adopted in south of France when I was 10. So I have quite a lot of memory from Madagascar by the time I was adopted. And as you mentioned in my intro, it was quite a white dominant area in south of France. So it was kind of a culture shock when I arrived in France because I didn't see many people who looked like me, and the culture was very different in terms of what you eat, what the weather, the how you dress, everything, the language. So that was kind of a culture shock in itself to adapt. So it's been a bit of struggle. My teenagehood was around even to try to understand who I was and how I fit in with my adoption, but also struggling with a lot of emotion that I didn't know at the time it was linked to my adoption. It's only later on in my adulthood that I understood that some of the things that I was struggling with was linked to adoption because I haven't really fully grieved things and emotions along the way. So it's been a journey of rediscovering myself and understanding what my journey has been. But at the same time, I also left France when I was 18 to go to university in the UK, and then I kind of get involved in the Black community in the UK, and I did a lot of work recently, especially I've been doing a lot of work around African history, so I was working with African and Caribbean community, so that really helped me to understand my heritage and my history and learning about African history, African culture. So I think that through that process, I really learned to know about my own identity and where I fit in and how to I suppose, embrace both the African side of me, but also my upbringing in France and living in the UK at the same time. So bringing everything into one. Because as a transracial adoptee, very often we get stuck in those two worlds and we don't know where we belong. But for me to be able to move forward, I had to reconcile those two worlds to be able to be who I am today.
Yeah, I really like how you said it on your website too. I'll just read a sentence that stood out to me from that. You said, "For a long time, I didn't realize that my adoption caused so much trauma in me." Mm-hmm. How old do you think you were when you started to realize that your adoption had caused trauma?
It's in my 20s. I mean, at 20, I had a daughter, which in itself was a challenge because I was still trying to figure out who I was. And here I am having to care for a child myself. And I think seeing a human being that looked like you, because for a long time I was in a white environment and I didn't have anyone to connect who just looked like me. And it's I think at that moment all the emotions comes back, because the fear that am I good enough to take care of this child? How do I move on? Who am I even to bring this child to the world? How am I going to teach her about our heritage? I don't know anything about that. So it's a lot of question was coming back when she was born. And I think then I wanted to learn a lot more about my heritage. I went back to Madagascar in 2010. And originally it wasn't really to meet up with my birth family, but it was more about me wanting to reconnect with Africa. But one thing led to another. I did end up going to see my family, and I wasn't prepared at all at the time either. And I think that also pushed all the emotion upwards at the time. And I think as my daughter was growing up, I could see that she was struggling. It's always like just generational trauma. I could see some of the thing I was struggling, she was carrying forward. And so that's where I really needed to question myself, and I cannot allow her to be in that same position, even if she's not adopted. I still think she's carrying for myself because I have not healed from my own trauma. So having to take that journey and question, how can I provide the better, journey for herself? I think that really pushed me to question it and to see that actually I've never really grieved, because the reason I was adopted is my birth mother passed away. So I was left with the Catholic missionary who were based in the village where I was at the time. And then I went to orphanage before being adopted in France. So I think when I had my daughter and all this emotion came through, then I realized, wow, I've never really grieved about my mother's death. I was 10, but yet I didn't have the process of, coming to terms with that. I've just suppressed all those emotions inside me. And I think my adoptive parents were not prepared either, because they didn't really have that much information about what's happened. So they didn't really know that I needed to grieve about my mother's loss. But I would say, now knowing the things that I know, adoption is a separation. So any separation will create some trauma. So I think even in that itself, even if my mother didn't pass away, there is still separation and there's trauma attached to that. And also as I grew up, I think then realized, I was 10-year-old, so there is already a lot of things that I remember, although some of it I've suppressed again. So I forgot a lot of my childhood in Madagascar, but there's things that I think the only thing that I remember is the traumatic period of my life. So when there is like natural disaster, and we had a cyclone in Madagascar, I vividly remember those things. At 5-year-old, I nearly drowned in a river, and I vividly remember those things as well. So, and those are the things that actually I've not even processed. So it's normal that now all the fears and all those emotions, and I don't really know who I am. And on top of that, with the adoption, I suppose, my parents, the first year I was in France, my mom had me, homeschooled me. So she was very present, but I think there was no preparation on how, I think because they're not used to having a Black community around them, so they were not prepared to receive the Black child and care for her. So there was no preparation in terms of how to support her into a white community and a white culture. So for me, I felt that I had to suppress everything that I was and suppress all my own culture, because I didn't speak my own language anymore. I didn't dress the same way as I used to dress in Madagascar. I didn't eat the same food, but none of those were explained to me. And I think I took those quite hard and suppressed who I was for 10 years. Suddenly I had to be assimilated to this new culture and become this new person and follow these new rules. It's the same. In Madagascar, I was raised quite liberal, I was up to the age of 10, I would run around in the streets. Arrive in France, it's a very structured upbringing. I was in a Catholic family and, going to church, which is something I was not used to be doing. So I think a lot of those, then I had to almost to comply to this new life and behave a very different way, not to create trouble, I suppose, for the family, and to be the model child in a way. But I know it's also conflicting inside me, and I think those are the emotions that I didn't know at the time that was created by the adoption itself. The process just make all those emotions clash.
Yeah. Well, as you're describing all of that, it sounds like it would be hard to find room to actually be able to grieve the loss of your mother and your culture, because you have so many things that are present that you're having to cope with. The different food and the different dress and the people looking different. Those are all in your face 100% of the time. And there's just not this room, unless it's really intentional, to grieve these unseen losses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So you said that you reconnected with your birth family. What was that experience like?
A roller coaster.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, there was the emotion of like the happiness of reconnecting with even just going back to where me and my mother lived. So going, standing in that compound where we lived was just so amazing, because I was 10 years old, you remember things, and just like all the emotion floating of memories of being in that space when I was a child and seeing my mother in my mind, and the house. That was all very overwhelming. And also because everybody was so welcoming in a way. When I find my uncle, it was just a big party. They had dancing and cooking as soon as I realized I was back.
Were you in your 20s when you went back there, or were you?
I was in my late 20s, so 2000.
Okay.
Yeah, and but the aftermath of that has been the difficult part, because people have not seen it for many years, and suddenly they know you're in the West, and there is this image that in the West you've got money. And so when I was back in the UK after the trip, it was all the communication was about trying to support them. They wanted my niece to come and stay with me, and I was a single mother at the time, overwhelmed with my own responsibility as a mother, and the everyday life. And I couldn't see myself having to welcome my niece and have her to stay with us. And I think they couldn't understand it. So the relationship can deteriorate over time. And I had to distance myself because it was just too much for me. But also, again, it creates a lot of emotion, because then there is the guilt, and you always should be able to support your family. You have a better life than men.
Yeah, and you have this desire
Yeah.
to be able to support them, but knowing what your own limits are, that would be very difficult.
Exactly. So it's been like a bittersweet moment, just reconnecting. And I'm still quite distant. I mean, my brother passed away in Madagascar last year, and again, that was a very difficult moment, because I decided to keep my distance, but at the same time, I was like, oh, he would have been the last person I could really reconnect and really understand my story, because we lived together and he knew my mother better than anyone else. So for me to get the the question I had, I think, was the closest of the person that I could have asked, and now he's gone.
Was he an
So
older
that
brother?
was difficult. Pardon?
Was he an older brother?
Yes, yes. So
Oh,
he stayed in Madagascar. So
okay.
we kind of, when I was adopted, we lost contact, but when I went back, we kind of reconnected, although we didn't see each other because we were in a different part of the island. But we kind of kept contact, but still me keeping distance. We didn't really become that close at the same time, but there was that regret of not reconnecting at the
Well,
same time.
it seems like, I don't know if that's something that people outside the adoption community consider a lot. When they know someone who's adopted, I think people are very encouraging and supportive of them finding their birth family, but they might not always know what's going on in the mind of an adoptee, of you're opening a new box of opportunity. It could be wonderful and there could be these great connections, but then, like in your experience, new trauma could happen that inspires new feelings of current situations with the family that makes it hard to cope with now, when before you've sort of dealt with the past, but then you're opening it all up again if you reconnect with birth family. So that is, I appreciate you sharing that because that's not often talked about.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, us as an adoptee as well, we create all sorts of narrative in our head before that reunion because, we've got this wonderful idea that is going to be so beautiful reconnecting with our birth family. And like you say, some people have had really beautiful story of reunion, but it's not always that straightforward in many cases. And that's why I say I wasn't prepared, because in my head, if I was going to be reconnected to my family, I saw it very differently to the way it happened. I mean, looking back, I don't regret meeting them all because I probably would not have gone to have this reconnection if it didn't happen the way it happened. So I am glad I still managed to go and meet my uncles in very different surrounding that what I've been raised in the West, and being able to see that that moment was so welcoming, and I keep that memory very dear. So I don't regret it. There's a lot of emotion that came after that, for sure, that needed to be processed. But I think even if I had to do it again, I will do it again, because I still feel like I then had a connection with my family instead of being kept in the dark forever. That and also because part of it is when I went back and met my uncle didn't even realize I was adopted. And that has been a big thing in my whole life, that, my whole family, my mother passed away and my whole family abandoned me. Nobody came for me. Whereas, and that is a question we still not resolved in my adoption story today, is what's happened between my mother left me at the Catholic missionary and me being adopted. So why was I put into an orphanage when my family was still living in the village? So there's a lot of that I don't have any answer at the moment. And the people were at the Catholic missionary at the time have all passed away now. So I would get a straight answer to that. But so that's kind of is some of the problem I had around abandonment. So I am glad that if I didn't go there, I would still feel today that my whole family abandoned me, but that wasn't the case. So it's you have to take, I think for me, the way I saw it is I take the good side of that journey and keep that. And life is not always straightforward. So just take the good side of it and move with that.
Yeah. Was your adoptive family supportive of you reconnecting with your birth family?
Yes and no. So I received a letter from my half sister from Madagascar when I was 15. And again, I don't know how she managed to find my address, because they're not supposed to have known where I've gone. So there's that not very clear line what's happened, how she managed to discover that. And at the time when I told my parents, oh, it's my sister who's writing, they were very cautious, and probably for the good reason that they wanted to protect me, that I don't, get into a scam or something. So I suppose at the time I didn't really push it. I just like, okay, maybe it's better that I don't follow this up, because at the time I didn't even realize I had a half sister. So in my mind, it could have been anybody else. And when my parents were saying to be cautious, I was like, okay, I'm just leaving it. But I don't know. I think, like I said, when my daughter was born and I was asking a lot of questions, that's when then I decided to respond to that letter. But by the time I was, it was in my 20s and I was old enough to do those steps by myself. So I didn't really ask, I suppose, for permission from my parents to just take the steps. Yeah, so I think it just naturally just went in, but they didn't, I suppose they didn't like from their own initiative to say, oh, let's go and find your birth family. So it's not that process.
So growing up, when you had questions about your birth family or your culture or your story from the first 10 years of your life, what were those conversations like? Did you feel like your parents did the best they could to answer those questions, or did you feel like things were, your feelings were put aside because it was uncomfortable conversations? What was that part of it like for you and your parents?
We didn't really have those conversations. That's the interesting thing about it, because that's why I say it's almost like I had to assimilate myself to everything. So it's almost like that part of my life was completely forgotten. I think, some of this conversation might have happened when it's time to do my hair, because I remember my mother was good enough to find a black hairdresser and, drive 2 hours away in a bigger town, and go to an African hairdresser. But even that we didn't really have any deep conversation. She would drive me there and pick me up after my hair was done. And that was not right at the beginning. I think she was taking me to a white hairdresser for a long time until realizing that my hair was not taking it. So
Right.
I think eventually having to find an alternative. But also once a year we used to have like a reunion with all the children that has been adopted from the same agency in France. So for most of my teenagehood, I suppose we had that kind of connection. So I will meet all those children in that process. So I guess my parents still have a little bit of advice, I suppose, where to go from the agency in terms of what to care. And at this time, the agency would bring like a present back from Madagascar to a lot of the children, or there would be like a store where my parents would buy T-shirt and bags from Madagascar, which are some of them I still have, funny enough. But those were I think the only time you will have kind of mention about the culture side. We were not that embedded in learning about the culture.
Yeah, there is a book that I just finished reading. Maybe you've read it too. It's called Black is the Body by Emily Bernard.
Okay.
It is excellent. It is a book of essays by an English professor at what university is she in? Let's see, at the University of Vermont. And she's Black. She's married to a white man, and they adopted two girls from Africa. I believe it was Ethiopia. And she writes about the story that she tried to tell her daughters about, just about their adoption story, because not a lot was known. And so I want to read part of it to you, because this is coming from her perspective as an adoptive parent. And I want to know, for you as an adoptee, would this kind of narrative be helpful for transracial adoptees? Okay, so let me find it here. It says, This is what she would tell her daughters. You are adored on two continents. You have two worlds, two countries, two languages, and two stories about how you came to be. And she said, so far, the strategy seems to be working. My daughters belong to a history preserved in the recesses of their minds and hearts, in their bodies too, perhaps down to the level of the cell, where the girls' identities reside in the worlds between past and present, here and there. That is a story that they will make up on their own. Do you have any thoughts or reactions to that narrative that a parent could tell to an adoptee?
Yeah, I believe that's a very positive message narrative because they're still trying to empower our daughters that, this is where you're coming from and this is where you are now, so the past and the present. And that's what I was saying at the beginning, I had to reconcile both my African side and my Western upbringing, because you cannot be one or the other, even if you want to, because those things has happened in your life. And I think if you get that imprinted in you from early on, I think you will help your identity that, you are this African child and you've been raised there and you're not just a Western identity, there's more of you from your past that make up who you are. So I feel that is important, and I really respect all the parents of transracial children who make the effort to talk to their children about their cultural background and also to surround themselves of people who might look like their children and go to events that are run by a Black community in the case of Black children. So really embedding the children in both lives. So, if they're Black, into the Black community, but also involve them in their white community. So having both sides, so the children can grow up to see that, it's okay to be both in those both worlds. And they can, from early on, navigate those two worlds. Because in my case, having been for so long in the white space, when I went to the UK and realized, oh my goodness, I'm not in the village anymore. Everything is so different. There's Black people. People are going to tell you things that I've never heard before about race. So, and some of it is not nice that being thrown at you and you don't understand those things. It's, again, that's hard to the trauma in itself because you're not prepared to the wide world that, you've been so protected and in this little bubble of a white community, for my case, in this little bubble of south of France where you don't really see much diversity. And when I get to places like London, it's very different and you have to navigate very differently. That was, again, another new thing I have to navigate in itself. So I think from the beginning, if you encourage your children to navigate those two worlds, it will make their life a lot easier when they grow up.
When you say when you go to the UK, you go to London and you realize you have to navigate everything differently, can you give examples of what that means for you?
Well, in south of France, it's a village. I mean, you see the same faces all the time. In London, it has so many different nationality and culture around, and it's even things like, some part of London, like you go to South London, where there's a predominantly Black community. I didn't feel comfortable, even though I was Black. I didn't feel comfortable to be in that space because it was so foreign for me at the time. For me, I was just comfortable in the white space, and this is where the contradiction is for us as a transracial adoptee, because we are in a Black body, but we navigate in a white space. So when you put us in a Black space, we don't know how to behave or to walk because we never had that learning. Those two spaces function very differently. And I remember even when after moving to the UK for several years and moved to South London, I still feel like I didn't know enough. Like going to the market, there's fruit and vegetable I didn't even know that I should be knowing. Um, and those things you feel then, it's that sense of like, I'm not white enough to be white and I'm not black enough to be black. And, I'm too black to be white and I'm not black enough to be black. So it's that sense of like, where do I fit? I can't really fit in any space. So it's very difficult to navigate.
How about now? It sounds like you've had some time to live in these two different spaces and to confront some of the trauma and the difficulty of having those separate identities and trying to merge them together. So how do you feel about it now? Do you feel comfortable in both spaces? Have you found this settledness, or do you think you're still learning and searching a little bit?
No, I think I'm comfortable now, but it's been a long journey, I would say, and I think I couldn't do it. For me, it was important I go through that journey if I was going to support the adoptee. And it's that reconciliation, being able to feel comfortable with the two sides of me. And it's also about being comfortable in your own skin. I think that self-worth is so important, and having a lot of compassion for yourself, for your journey, and acceptance is important. So this is my past. It hasn't been beautiful. There's been beautiful moments, but it hasn't always been beautiful, and accepting that so you can move forward, and really taking what is good from both sides that really fit with me to be who I am today, and just let go the things that doesn't really serve me or doesn't resonate with me. And that is okay, even if there's things that might, for example, the Catholic religion. I was really raised in the Catholic religion, and that for a long time was almost trapping me. I didn't feel like I didn't want upset my parents not to be Catholic anymore. So for a long time, I didn't know how to go about it. But now I feel comfortable to say that, I believe in God, but I am not a practicing Catholic. And that has been freeing to be able to say that to myself. So it's finding those place where what is comfortable for you and letting go the things that are not comfortable, from those both sides, from your past, also from where you've been brought up, and really just keep the thing that is comfortable, and that is what is going to make you, and have built your own identity around what make you happy and make you feel comfortable.
Have you been able to have conversations like this with your parents?
We tried. I mean, it's been a long journey because we had to about the religion, for example, because it's such a big element of their life. So I had to explain why I was stepping away from that religion, because it didn't. It's not to disrespect them. I had to explain it's not the lack of disrespect or because I was not grateful the way they raised me. It didn't fit with me. And if I continue to live in that space, I will make myself sick because I wasn't happy in that space. And I think it was difficult for them to accept. But at the end of the day, if you love your child, you allow them to be where they are. And I think they come to terms that, if I go to France and stay with them, I'm not going to go to church with them. So I think they come to terms with that. And a lot of different things around that, but and I completely understand it from their point of view. They've also been raised into that space, and that's all they know. So it's normal that that's what they gave to their children as well. So I know they're coming from a good space, but it's reminding people that the children are their own person as well. So they might not grow exactly how you want them to be.
I realized I didn't ask. You said children. Did you have brothers and sisters?
So, well, it's my parents was foster parents. So there was about 5 or 6 foster children in the house. Then they had 2 of their own biological children, and then there was 2 of us adopted. So it was a big house.
Oh, wow. So how many kids altogether?
Well, because the foster children would come and go, so it was never always the same. But it go between 5 and 10 at a time. So it was there's always a lot of people around.
And were there other Black children in the home ever?
Yeah, so there was another girl who was adopted from Madagascar. So she came after me. We're not blood related, but we are from the same country.
And what was that like? How old were you when she was adopted as well?
I think I was about 12, so a couple of years after I've arrived. Yeah, that was an interesting because our journey is very different from mine, and that's again, I would say to parents who adopt children, the children might not live that experience the same way, even though for us we are both Black, both from the same country, but we lived the adoption very differently. And part of it, I think, is because my sister stayed in south of France and, in that small space. And whereas I went to the UK and go to the big city, lived a very different experience. So it's what we call the compliant adoptee. She was happy with her adoption. Whereas for me, I had all the trauma. But again, I would say, she was a baby. She was 2 when she was adopted. I was 10. Again, we have a completely different experience. So again, I suppose it's normal that we react in a very different way. But yeah, so it's not always the same experience for 2 siblings that have been raised in the same family.
So you said so your parents adopted her when she was 2?
Yes.
Okay, so then you were adopted. She was already, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What moments or experiences have you had that you could share that have helped you heal? Are there specific times that you remember having a realization that things are better now than they were, or I found somebody who understands me, I feel like I'm healing? Can you share any of those moments with us?
Yeah, I mean, it's been gradual. I think the birth of my daughter has definitely make me realize there was issues that I needed to address. And I think from then on, it was just trying to find tools and to help me heal and what can I do to make myself feel better. So I've tried so many different modalities and therapy. I've done some Reiki and kinesiology, all sorts of modalities. But I think going to Madagascar has been definitely it was hard, but I know healing is not easy. It has been a defining moment because, like I said, I had this awareness that I wasn't abandoned by my family. So I could then accept that. So that was a very big moment for me. What else? I think I did a whole course around self-compassion, and that has been really like a game changer because I didn't realize how deep my it's almost like your self-hatred, until I put some self-compassion in myself. The way I talk to myself, I didn't realize that I was so negative with myself. And also during that process, I had to reconnect with my inner child and really learning to love that 10-year-old me who arrived in France because she was lost she had nobody really to be there for her. So having to reconnect with that child and really be compassionate and feeling love, I think that's really helped me, because then I could then accept myself as an adult. And it's that acceptance of saying, it's okay, you are where you're supposed to be. Things will be okay. So I think, yeah, those, and I've always had mentors and coaches along the way as well. So I think that also helps. They've not always been in the space of adoption, but I would say people who are very aware of trauma-informed practices, and that have really helped me along the way. But yeah, so it's different modality.
Yeah, and it with you reconnecting with your 10-year-old self, it's like you're giving her the language that you didn't have at the time.
Yeah.
Your parents didn't have that language necessarily, because
Yeah.
I think adoption in general has changed a lot over the decades. I like to think there's a little bit more awareness generally around mental health and supporting adoptees. It still has a long, long way to go. But for your parents to not have language to give you, you're giving her that language so that you can heal. So
Yeah.
That is
Yeah,
something
and I think that language is really important, because like I said, when you grow up, you don't have the language, you don't understand what's going on. And even it's just putting a language, what I'm feeling is shame and guilt. Just understanding, putting something against it, then okay, so I know what this is now. How can I work around that and heal that part of me? And I think again, that is it. We've been so fragmented for the adoption and all the trauma. It's like we separate, we're disconnecting with our body. And that is another thing that really helped me, I suppose, is reconnecting to my body, because for a long time, I was disconnecting. So doing a lot of movement work has been really, really useful for me to come back to my own body and reconnect with all those different parts that I've let go because of the trauma. I think it was kind of a survival mode and hiding to hiding place. So I wasn't really fully me. So having to then reconnect and reappropriate those different parts has been really important. Yeah.
I want to ask a little bit about your experience as an adoptee coach, but before I do that, I want to ask a little bit about advice that you have for parents of a transracial adoptee. Do you think that would you say it should be a requirement, or at least like strongly encourage that they should live in a diverse city? Or do you think that there are parents who can succeed with their transracial adoptee in a predominantly white community? What are your thoughts on supporting an adoptee who has been disconnected from so much more than just their birth family?
I feel parents should be surrounded by diversity and people who look like the child, because the children didn't ask about being moved around. And very often it's the child who's being made uncomfortable. But if you're willing to adopt a child, I feel that you should also put yourself in that discomfort of learning that child's background and diversity. So I know a lot of family would say they're not familiar with that community, and it's not comfortable to move into that space, but you are asking your child to move into that space, to your own space. So why can't you do the same thing for yourself? And, I always use this analogy to a lot of people, and I think it might be controversial, but I always say to people, imagine yourself being taken away to Africa, disconnected from everything that is white, and being taken into a Black country. and don't have any connection with the white community, how would you feel? Wow. And just sit with that and see what's how you feel. And I think that is an important thing, because if you are able to see how you'd feel in that community, if it was you was taken in the other reverse situation, then I think you will be able to understand a little bit more what your child is feeling, being taken away from everything that they know. It's being stripped out of their own identity and culture.
We see it from the other way so often, that like in your situation, from Madagascar to France, it's like from Africa to Europe or to the US. But you're right, if you think about it for just a few seconds, you would understand it, instead of just thinking like putting all the support and praise on the adoptive parents, which it is a great thing, but to recognize the difficulty and the trauma that comes with it.
Yeah.
So any other things that you would say to parents of a transracial adopted child?
I think it's about education as well. I think, sometimes parents go into the adoption for many different reasons, and maybe thinking that, oh, it's going to be the same as raising my own child that I've given birth to, but it's not going to be the same. And even if it's a baby, from the work I did and from all the podcasts I've interviewed quite a lot of adoptees, even as a baby, that child is still being separated from his mother. There is still going to be trauma, no matter at what age that separation is. So having that understanding and educating yourself around trauma and anything else to do with the child, I think it's really important for that relationship that you're going to build with your child. So if you can prepare yourself enough in advance, I know some agencies do prepare, but not always the case. But I would say for the parents to do their own work. And also that's the other thing I think is important, doing your own work in terms of growth. I think you need to be, if you've had some trauma in the past, because that also can bring up your own trauma later on by bringing a child into your own world. So that part of the preparation, that, make sure that you've also done your own work, that you're not going to be triggered later on. And that can also impact on the child, your relationship with the child. So yeah, preparation, I think, is important in terms of cultural, in terms of, practicality, material things that you can bring to the child. I mean, for example, in my parents' house, there was nothing that, decoration, for example, little things like that. We didn't have nothing that looked like cultural, that was related to my own country. So there is nothing that I could relate, even in the house. So even little things like that you could bring in your house will be helpful.
Yeah, that's good advice, because the physical environment reflects the people that are in the house, and you want to bring in elements of the culture so that everybody feels at home. So it feels like a new family, because you're bringing in someone who is not from your same background. So as an adoptee coach, what are some common themes that you encounter with your work with these adoptees?
I think that definitely around self-worth is a big one. Because like I said earlier, a lot of the adoptees try to assimilate themselves to the family, and very often they don't want to be making too much noise, not to make feel too big or too different. So they minimize themselves, and I think that really impacts the self-worth as they grow on. So I've also got a lot of issue around boundaries. And that, again, is linked to the self-worth, because that we tend to be people pleaser by trying to not disturb people too much. Then we become people pleaser, and then we don't know how to set boundaries. So that's a big one, I think. the guilt
Probably,
and shame as
sorry,
well. It's
can
been, yeah.
say that one more time. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say the guilt and the shame, that's come back very often because, in the environment where you're being adopted, very often people don't understand why you're feeling the way you're feeling, and they're like, oh, you should be feeling grateful to have been adopted. Your life will not be the same. So then you feel guilty because, oh, I'm not feeling grateful. And then that brings shame as well because, oh, I'm so different to everybody else. Yeah, it's an heavy emotions that a lot of adoptees carry with them, and I think that's his part. I mean, as a coach, I don't go into all those deep traumatic issues because that is part of what they do in therapy. As a coach, I will only take them from where they are today to where they need to be in their life, whereas a therapist will take them from where they are and look back, trying to heal all the trauma from the past. So it's a very different part of the journey, I would say, between a therapy and a coach. What else would come back? I think the relationship has been coming back a lot. We having difficulty building healthy relationship because of the abandonment and rejection that we've experienced in our journey. We don't know how to feel safe in a relationship, and very often also we self-sabotage ourselves because we are so afraid of being abandoned that we will reject people, even if it's an healthy relationship, because we've got that fear running through our vein that someone is going to abandon ourselves again.
I've heard some of what you've described before, that the people pleasing is very common, sabotaging relationships. It's almost like there's this safety mechanism that if I can force the worst scenario outcome, then I'm sort of in control in a way. And there are these patterns that have developed in order to feel safe. And it's you don't even realize that you're doing it until you talk to somebody like you or talk to a therapist.
Yeah.
So one other question about your coaching experience. Have you coached adoptees in the UK and the US, or pretty much exclusively in the UK?
At the moment, I've only been in the UK and Europe. But with my podcast, I've been speaking with a lot of people from the US, interestingly. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder if the themes that come up are different, if the Black experience in the US as an adoptee is different than in the UK or in Europe.
I think the themes are very similar, at least from what I understand for the podcast. I think it's the theme that I've just mentioned. Everybody tend to say they've been struggling with those. But I would say I think the Black experience in America is very different to the Black experience in Europe. So again, there's a nuance about how people will live their adoption because it's a different history again. And also a lot of the Black adoptee I've spoken to in America, it's domestic adoption. It's not transracial, international adoption. So there is a little bit of nuance in their experience that, they have not been flown from a completely different culture. They were still in America, being adopted in America. So they don't necessarily have to deal with the cultural side of things, but I would say they still face the racial inequality and that kind of racism. So those still come up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. When at the beginning, when you were describing you lost your family and your food and your culture, even the way people dress is different. The whole environment is different. And if it's a domestic adoption, the difference wouldn't be as drastic as what you experienced, definitely. So is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would want to share with us?
Good question.
No pressure.
I don't know. No, I think the only thing I would say is, to parents who are thinking, or either in the journey of already having adopted or thinking about adopting, is really think about the child first. I know you are there, but remember that the child have not asked for any of this. They're just being put in the process, and it might be small and then not realize it at the time, but when they grow up, the issue will catch them up. So I've the understanding now that there's going to be issue that's coming up with the child. I don't think there's any perfect adoption, like there's any perfect parenting or perfect upbringing. So having that in the back of your mind I think it's important, because that will help the relationship with the child. And having the open communication throughout the adoption journey is also very important. And I think that's what I would say.
Awesome. Well, Christelle, thank you so much for sharing your advice, your insight, and your story with us. It's been awesome to talk to you today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed meeting you and talking to you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Open Adoption Project.
We hope you found this content helpful and enjoyable. If so, we would love for you to share it with a friend or an acquaintance that it might help.
We'd also love to connect with you on social media. We're on Instagram at Open Adoption Project, or you can look us up on our website, openadoptionproject.org.
Thanks so much for being here with us and learning with us.